Hello and welcome to this AHDB Bedding and Pot Plant Centre webinar examining the subject of aphid control on ornamentals. I'm Wayne Brough, AHDB Knowledge Exchange Manager, and today's webinar will consist of a dual presentation by two ADAS speakers. But before I introduce them, just a few the usual housekeeping points just to go through. As usual, the audience will be on mute throughout, but please pose questions and I'll come to how to do that in a moment. The webinar will last about an hour, give or take 5 minutes. It will be recorded, so if you need to leave or if you want to pass it on to colleagues, it will be available on the AHDB website later on. Basis and also points should have been sent out, but there will be a handout available, and I'll come on to that on the next slide. So in the top right-hand corner of your screen, you should have a box, something similar to the one shown there. Perhaps with slightly different functionality, but just a few buttons to sort of mention there to make life easy for everyone. If you do need to minimize that particular box, press the red button with the white arrow. That minimizes the actual box and puts it out of the way. Before you do so, if you want to pose a question, and please do so throughout the entire webinar, click the questions bar, and in the drop-down menu and drop-down box, please pose the question to each speaker. I'll keep an eye on them and I'll pause them at appropriate points and at the end of the webinar. Just above that is the handout bar. So if you click that, what you should get in the drop-down menu is a handout. Please feel free to download the handout during the presentation. It's a collection of all today's slides. And as I said before, the recording will be available probably next week on the AHDB website if you need to reference it later on. So today's program consists just of the one presentation, specifically looking at aphid control, and it's going to be delivered jointly by Chloe and David. As I said before, we can take questions at appropriate moments through the presentation and at the end of the webinar. So before I pass over, just a quick introduction to our speakers. Both today's speakers are ADAS consultants. David and Chloe are involved in consultancy and R&D covering ornamentals. Both have been involved in previous delivery of trials and events linked to the Bedding and Pot Plant Centre, and today's focus, as I said, is on the issue of aphid control. So without further ado, if I can pass over to Chloe now, and we'll commence today's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you for that introduction. Now, hopefully everybody can see my slides. So this morning, David and I are going to talk to you about why am I having difficulty controlling aphids in my crop. But the focus of this presentation is not to be kind of a lecture on aphids and teaching you everything about them, but more kind of a focus on the common questions that growers tend to ask quite a lot. So rather than just kind of going through everything, kind of focusing in on the things that you find difficult in terms of control, and hopefully the things that we cover in this presentation are going to be beneficial to both you and your business. So as in terms of an overview, these are the questions that we're going to be kind of focusing on mainly throughout this presentation. So first of all, looking at why do aphids suddenly just tend to appear on the crop? Can the aphid infestations be prevented in the first place? Are some more difficult to control than others? Quite importantly, how do I decide which insecticide to apply, and does it depend on what type of aphid that I have? How do I encourage native biocontrol? Why isn't my biocontrol working? Can bioprotectants be used to help control aphids? And can conventional pesticides be used alongside biocontrols? And then we've got some sources of further information at the end for you. So looking at why do aphids suddenly appear? Well, in truth, they don't, but it's not normally until you start to see a large infestation that you become aware of the fact that the aphids are there. And then so it seems like they've suddenly just appeared, but it only takes obviously one or two to go unnoticed, and suddenly that can build up into many, many aphids that are then going to start to cause you an issue. So where can they come from in the first place? Tend to sometimes come in on bought-in plant material, not always, but sometimes. And like I say, it can only be one or two aphids on a huge batch of bought-in plant material. But if the conditions are right and they haven't been noticed, then they can quite quickly start to multiply and become an issue for you. They can also be found in crop debris. So maybe during the kind of busy season when crops are moving out quite quickly and bits and pieces can get left on the floor, that can be quite a nice haven for the aphids and other pests to just kind of congregate and build up within that debris. And then obviously eventually they're going to want to then move from that debris onto nice new fresh crops. So trying to keep on top of that crop debris and cleaning things up as quickly as you can is very important. Or maybe you've got some plants that haven't been sold and they're just kind of older stock that are sat in a corner. That can be a nice area sometimes for aphids to start building up on. They can come through the open vents as well. So just dropping down through the glasshouse vents into the crop and then making a nice little population immediately under the vents. And also weeds. So these can be good alternative hosts. So common chickweed is quite a good example. So those little weeds that you might spot in the corner of a glass house or maybe under a bench that look quite small and not really doing much of a problem, they can be a nice little hotspot for aphids to colonize. And then once they kind of grow out or become too big a colony for that weed, then they're going to want to start moving onto your crop. So the point here is to scout early and scout regularly. So make sure that you are going through your crops on a regular basis. You are checking things as they come in. I'll go into this in a little bit more detail in some next slides anyway. But the important thing, scout early, scout regularly. So this is what we want to avoid, and I know that we all pretty much know the kind of damage that we see from aphids, but just to reiterate what they can do if you don't notice that there's a problem until it's a bit too late or until the population has really started to grow. So in terms of the direct effects, you can get the actual feeding damage, which in turn leads to leaf and shoot tip distortion. So you can see this image here of the aphid distortion on the bellis, where those leaves there in the centre, they're really starting to look quite distorted. And if the plant doesn't grow away from that, then that might lead to an unmarketable crop. You may also notice that quite often with aphids, you can get almost a sticky substance on the crop itself. So this is honeydew that's excreted by the aphid. Not very pleasant in itself, and if there is a lot of it, then that can sometimes lead to the creation of sooty mold on the leaves. So this is just like a black, dusty looking type of mold that grows on the surface, and it can be wiped off, but obviously that's labour intensive, it's unsightly, and people aren't going to want to purchase plants that have got this sooty mold growing on it. So we really want to avoid that from happening. Cast skins are another issue. So you can see that on that aphid damage picture on the fuchsia. So all of the little white bits that you'll find not just on the crop, but also on the top of the compost in the pot as well. So if you're starting to see cast skins, then you know that things are starting to build and you've got a bit of a problem on your hands. And obviously they're unsightly and help to reduce the plant quality. So obviously poor plant quality, like something with that aphid damage on fuchsia, hopefully that's something that we don't see very often, but it can happen. So we want to make sure that we're not getting to that stage and really reducing the plant quality into something that's unmarketable. And something else to bear in mind as well is virus transmission. So not just with aphids, but with other sucking pests, there is the potential that viruses can be transmitted from pests moving from one crop to another. So that's something to bear in mind, because obviously we're not going to want viruses being transmitted among plants. So keeping on top of aphids and keeping on top of pests in general will help minimise the risk of virus transmission within the crop. So can aphid infestations be prevented in the first place? And with this, our focus is always on biosecurity and starting clean and staying clean. So you want to be kind of obviously getting plants from approved suppliers, so people that have a good track record, and maybe you want to go and visit those suppliers every now and then just to see how things are grown and just to see what kind of practices they have in place to keep pests down on their crop before it's then sent out to yourselves. So that's number one. Secondly, risk assess. So when plants come in, you want to inspect and quarantine on arrival potentially. So in the kind of quieter months when maybe you haven't got too many plants coming in, then obviously it's fairly easy to kind of check on those when they come in, inspect them and just make sure that they're free of pests. But what do you do when you suddenly get to the height of spring and summer and you've got loads and loads of plants coming in? Do you try and assess all of them, or do you just focus on the ones that you know are a particular problem? So dahlia, for example, quite prone to aphid infestation. Do you simply decide to look at the ones that you know are going to probably be more problematic or could be more problematic and focus a bit more on those? So it's about assessing your risks and managing things in a way that's suitable for you. And if you do decide that you want to designate a separate area for new stock, then make sure that people within the business are well aware of that and know that that's an area that they just need to focus a little bit more on and keep an eye out for pests within that crop. Thirdly, we want to be crop walking regularly and inspecting plants for signs of pests and diseases. So when you're doing this, if you have a hand lens, that's great, because quite often these pests, they start off very small and it's quite hard to sometimes see them. So pick up the plants, look for those distorted tips, look for cast skins, and look underneath the leaves as well, because quite often they're going to be hidden away in places where we're not going to see them if we're just kind of walking past and glancing and thinking, oh yeah, that looks fine. But when you actually pick up the plant and look underneath the leaf, then you start to see just the little aphids hiding away there. And if that goes unnoticed, then obviously they're just going to start building and building. So crop walking regularly and doing thorough inspections is a really good way of kind of getting on top of things quickly and minimising your risk of getting infestations later on. Liaising with your staff excuse me, and your crop workers is really important as well, because you can't be everywhere on the nursery all the time. But certain staff are dealing with those plants on a very regular basis, and transplanting staff, for example, they're the ones that are going to see things early on and see if there's a problem. So make sure that they know who to speak to if they do find anything that's wrong, and see if they can undergo some training to just recognise different pests and diseases, or if they don't know exactly, make sure that they know who to tell at least, so that somebody is being told that there's a potential problem with this crop before it kind of gets out onto the nursery, and that problem can then spread. So maintaining good communication within the team is really important. Also taking an IPM approach, so integrated pest management approach. So David's going to talk about this in a little bit more detail later on in some of his slides, but looking at ways that we can introduce biocontrols and really get on top of things early, so that we're not then trying to go in and kind of deal with a situation that's getting out of hand, because it's a lot harder then to get on top of an aphid problem. But if we can start early with an IPM approach, then it does make life simpler in the long run. And finally, if you have a hygiene policy, then make sure that that's well displayed and that people that work on the nursery are aware of the rules. So as I said with the previous point of good communication with staff, making sure that people know what to do and they know who to talk to, so that if they find a problem, it's something that can be rectified quite easily. So can nursery and hygiene practices help? Well, yes, there's a number of things that we can do to kind of minimise the risk of aphids getting out of hand. So as I mentioned in one of the previous slides, removing and disposing of crop debris regularly and quite quickly is very important. You don't want to just kind of leave it sitting there, because things will build up, pests and diseases, and then eventually this is going to spread to your new crop. So making sure that you're keeping on top of things and keeping clean is very important. And if you do find plants that have got a bad aphid infestation on them, then try and bag them up in situ, so you're not carrying them through and allowing aphids to fall off as you go through and drop onto other crops. Bag them up where they are and then get rid of them afterwards. And finally, controlling weeds that are potential secondary hosts, so things like chickweed and sow thistle. So you can see on this picture with this tiny little chickweed seedling growing out in the corner of the glasshouse, and probably would go unnoticed for quite a long time and doesn't really look like it's going to cause you much of an issue. But aphids love them, and that can be a hotspot for aphid colonization. But eventually they will spread because they will outgrow that weed, and then they will want to move on to the crop. So weeds do matter. Try and keep on top of them. Try and make sure that areas under benches and in corners are regularly cleared of any weeds. So now I just want to focus a little bit on the main aphid species that we tend to find in ornamental crops, and then later on David will mention a little bit more about how we can try and control these aphid species. So the first one that we're looking at here is the peach potato aphid, Mysis persicae. So how do we identify these? Well, you can see them with the naked eye, but to get a better look at them, then a hand lens is really useful. So if you look at this under the hand lens, then you will see with peach potato aphid, they tend to be pear-shaped, so they kind of come around into this nice point at the back here, and they can vary in colour. So they can be pale green or yellowish green or even pinky red on occasion. Now I've circled here the Suffonculi. So these are quite helpful distinguishing features when you're trying to identify what aphid species you have. So these are basically backward pointing tubes on the back of the aphid. So hopefully you can see these two little tubes here that are sticking out. So they secrete a waxy fluid when the aphid is under attack, and they are quite distinguishable for the different types of aphid species that we get on ornamentals. So on a peach potato aphid, they are reasonably long, and then you can see here that they've got these little black tips to them. Peach potato aphid also tends to have an indentation between the base of its antennae. So kind of looking at the shape of it, the pear shape, the Suffonculi, and the indentation between the antennae help us to identify that this is peach potato aphid. So these tend to form large colonies on the leaf undersides. So as I mentioned before, when you're crop walking and inspecting, looking under the leaves to make sure that there's nothing there. And they'll also develop on the young shoots, so they can then cause distortion and prevent the plant from growing properly. Peach potato aphid is resistant to some insecticides, and it does tend to infest a number of ornamental plants. So for example, fuchsia, impatiens, petunia, viola and primula. Peach potato aphid can be found on all of those. Secondly, we have the melon and cotton aphid, the Aphis specifii. So you can see straight away how different this one is to the peach potato aphid. Whereas peach potato is a nice green colour and quite shiny, well, that one's green, but quite shiny. This doesn't have a shiny appearance to it and is quite matte in colour. So again, these can alter in their colours, pale green to olive, dark, mottled green, or even black. They are small, but look at the Suffonculi on these ones, really short and black, so really quite easy to spot and identify that this is a melon cotton aphid that we're looking at here. It has antennae that are shorter than the body, and then they have no indentation at the base, whereas the peach potato one does. So another way of helping us to decide which one this is. This one itself is also resistant to some insecticides, and this in particular is a major pest of chrysanthemum and cyclamen. So it causes leaf distortion, and it can also then in turn lead to the development of sooty mold from the honeydew that it excretes. Next, we are looking at the potato aphid. So you can see that this one is quite similar to the peach potato aphid that we looked at earlier. So potato aphid is Macrocipher euphorbiae. So this has a similar pear-shaped body and the shiny appearance. So in terms of colour, it's quite often green or pink. Occasionally it can have a longitudinal stripe going down the back here. And in terms of Siphonculi, these are long and slender, but they've got no black tips on them like the aphid previously. So when you're looking at this one, quite similar to the peach potato aphid, but it's these Siphonculi that you're just kind of helping, or are helping you to distinguish between the two of those. Also the antennae, so hopefully you can just see these coming along here. So these are longer than the body, and there is an indentation between the base of them. Now, similar to other aphids, these will form colonies in the shoot tips and cause distortion. And we tend to see this one on dianthus, dahlia, pelargonium and fuchsia as quite common hosts of the potato aphid. And finally, we have the glasshouse potato aphid, the Uricauthum solani. So this one is also quite a shiny aphid in comparison to the melon and cotton aphid. So this is pale green or yellowish green in colour, and it also tends to have slightly darker patches on its body at the base of the Siphonculi. Now, these Siphonculi have also got black tips, as you can see there, but the aphid itself also has black markings on its leg joints and on its antennae as well. So you can see these quite clearly here, and there is an indentation between the antennae. And this will infect many plants, including fuchsia, pelargonium and verbena. As with others, it can lead to severe distortion, but it is important to be able to try and recognise these distinguishing features if you can, because the type of aphid that you have will affect to an extent how you can control it, both in terms of biocontrol and chemical control. So now I'm going to pass over to David, and he's going to go through in a little bit more detail how we can try and control these different types of aphids.
So, morning folks. Moving on, so are some aphids more difficult to control than others? So yes, Chloe's already alluded to this in the last couple of slides, but the melon cotton aphid and the peach potato aphid have got resistance to a range of insecticides. So we've got things like Aphox, Decis. There's likely to be resistance to these products with these aphid species. Although a neonicotinoid is listed there, that hasn't really been found in the UK, that's other countries, but it's there as a warning and a sort of note not to overuse products, and we'll cover that in a bit more detail in some of the following slides. Okay, next slide, Chloe. So how do I decide which insecticide to apply? So firstly, I would say on your crop walking, which Chloe's touched on, and really want to be doing those weekly. And if you or your staff haven't got a hand lens, one of the best bits of advice I would give you is to get one to help you with that. Then thinking, is an insecticide the best treatment? Depending on the numbers of aphids you're seeing. If there are low numbers and you're already introducing biological controls, you may feel that there is a level where they'll keep them in check, but this is the beauty of your weekly crop walking, and the information will feed in. If identifying the aphid species and where it is on the crop is very important, because if it's something like Macroscyphum euphorbia, potato aphid on dahlia, on the shoot tips, it presents a nice easy spray target, and we know that's easy control, and we've got more options to control that, contact acting type products. Whereas if you've got something like Aphids gossypii, melon cotton aphid, that has a waxy covering, which may make it more difficult to kill with some of the contact acting products. Also, the general habit of that aphid, it doesn't present itself on the shoot tips normally, so it's not easy to get good spray coverage. So a couple of decision factors there. And where you've got a challenging spray target like Aphids normally is, you're really looking at systemic type products, and we'll come on to products in a bit more detail on some of the following slides. Next slide. So how can I reduce the risk of resistance? Incorporating non-chemical control measures, so making use of biological controls is a very good thing to do and will help. Also, insecticides have been classified by the Insect Resistance Action Committee. Now, if people haven't heard about this, it's an international organisation that really looks to prolong the usefulness and efficacy of insecticides for the benefit of mankind on a global scale. So products used as insecticides are coded, and these codes enable us to use products with different codes that work in different ways. And by using products with different codes, you're reducing the chance of resistance developing. So it's a really useful system to make use of. If you're not aware of the code of your products, referring to the IRAC code, you can ask your consultant or the supplier of the product, and they should be able to tell you that. Some of the newer products have the IRAC codes on the product label. Always use plant protection products at the recommended rates. Don't be tempted to cut the rate, because that will increase the resistance risk, and ensure that nozzles and filters are blocked and sprayers are performing as they should. Next slide. So how do I encourage native biological control? Where you're not using any non-IPM insecticides like DCIS, you don't get these persistent residues that can persist for up to 3 months, which basically prevent biocontrols establishing and native predators moving into the crop. Where these sorts of products aren't being used, even where people aren't actually introducing biological controls, we typically see predators moving into the crop. You'll often see natural Aphidius type species parasitizing aphids within the crop. So it's definitely useful to avoid them if possible. Also, we heard on one of the previous slides, we've got resistance to pyrethroids in those couple of aphid species. So there are other options and better things that we can use. Regular crop monitoring really helps you to make risk-based decisions and is key to managing your crop. And just making the point, not all weeds are bad. So perennial nettles are a really good source of native biocontrols, and you're not going to want perennial nettles growing within your structures, but outside glass houses in managed areas, they can definitely contribute to pest control. Saying that, you don't want all the areas around the glass houses to be a mass of weeds just to allow some perennial nettles. So you can still manage the areas, mow round the clumps of perennial nettles that you're keeping and making use of to keep weed pressure down. And where you have got integrated pest management systems, you do generally benefit from naturally occurring biological controls moving into a crop in some forms. Next slide. So sometimes biological control doesn't work, and this slide looks to explore why that is. So are the insecticides or fungicides you're using compatible with the predators or parasitoids you're using? And this can be checked on a range of suppliers' websites. There's some information to come on some slides further through the presentation, so we'll revisit that. Really, you need to be using your biocontrols preventatively. Typically, these start being introduced from late March to April as temperatures increase, before we start to see aphids. And not all of them are used preventatively, so it's more the parasitoids, things like Aphidius, that parasitize aphids, that are used preventatively and introduced weekly. Their rates of introduction, for whether you're looking to just prevent problems with these parasitoids or whether you're looking to control any aphids. Now, they're a higher rate for control. As I said before, they're normally used preventatively. Also, temperatures need to be sufficiently high, so at the times of year I mentioned, they normally are naturally high enough, but it's, I would say, too early to use them in most cases unless you put in a lot of heat into structures at this time of year. Are the right species being introduced for the pest you're trying to control? We know different aphid parasitoids target different aphids, so things like Aphidius colemanii will target the smaller aphids such as the peach potato aphid, Mysis persicae, and the melon cotton aphid, Apis gossypii, whereas predators like parasitoids, like Aphidius urvi will target a larger aphid. So it's useful to identify your aphid species to be introducing the right predators to control those. To take the hassle out of this, there are mixed products of aphid parasitoids about, which will give you control of a range of aphid species. So that's an option. Also be aware that residues from a spray tank can have an impact. So if you've applied some sort of pyrethroid late on in the season, perhaps to control caterpillars on primulas, unless that spray has been washed out very thoroughly, we know they're very difficult to wash out. Those residues coming through in your first few sprays of the year can have an impact on predators establishing within crops. Next slide. So how soon can biologicals be introduced safely after pesticide application? Now this slide is just to give you a flavour really of some of the products that we're typically using for aphid control and some of the key aphid predators. So we've got Aphidius colemanii and Aphidius urvi there, which are the parasitic wasps that parasitize aphids and create the mummies that you'll see within the crop. And then we've got Aphidiletes, which is a midge, a little midge that looks a bit like a mosquito, and that seeks out aphid colonies and lays its eggs in those. And then you get small sort of orange coloured maggots that feed on the aphids. And Aphidiletes is more of a knockdown treatment if you get a little hotspot developing. So that slide's useful. It's taken from various sources. Just gives you a guide. As I said, it's useful to look on suppliers' websites, talk to your supplier of biocontrols. So we can see side effect ratings. It gives you an idea of percentage reduction of predators within the crop, and in brackets it's got the number of days that you're likely to get persistence. So just looking at Sprusit, for example, it's got very short persistence. So if you've got aphids, they're easy to target. You could apply a spray of that, apply your biocontrols a few days later, and you will have minimal impact on those biocontrols. If you've got any already there, it will obviously give them a bit of a knock, but it's making the sorts of decisions as to whether you can accept that to get the control and move forward. So, next slide. So we've got parasitoids and predators we can introduce, and this slide is looking at which aphid parasitoids I can introduce. So these lay their eggs inside aphids, and this example of some species there. So we already talked about Aphidius. In the mixes that are available, they often contain all of these different parasitoids. And the beauty of Aphilinus in the mix, you do get some host feeding of actual live aphids. That can also contribute to control. And the image there, well, the images there just show the small parasitic wasps coming out of the vial that they're supplied in, and there's a photo of one there on a nettle leaf. They're quite easy to see in the crop with hand lens, relatively small, but that's another thing. When you're crop walking, you'll get a gauge as to whether predators are actually active in the crop, and you'll be seeing mummies as well. Okay, next slide, Chloe. So thinking about predators, which aphid predators can I introduce? Predators feed directly on aphids, and there's various examples of these. We talked a bit about Aphidiletes, which is the midge-like predator. We've got good old ladybirds, Lacewings, hoverfly have recently been commercialized by some companies, and predatory bugs such as aureus. Now, quite a lot of these are generalist feeders, so they won't just take aphids. Aureus is a really good example of this. It'll help with any thrips pressure. Excuse me. Just a sort of word of note with ladybirds. Obviously, that's the larvae there in the middle image, and they have to change to an adult, and they can often do that on the crop. So if you've got really high number of aphids and you introduce ladybirds, that the larvae turning into adults could actually present a quality issue for you on an ornamental crop, largely because of customer ignorance. They don't know what they are and they see it as a potential contaminant. So that's just something to be aware of. Next slide. So you might not have heard about hyperparasitoids, but we can get predators of the predator, if that makes sense. So we've got the parasitoids that we're introducing to control the aphids, and then you can get naturally occurring hyperparasitoids that are actually predators of our parasitoids within the aphid. So it's possible to keep track of this when you're doing your crop monitoring. So the image on the bottom left shows an aphid mummy that's been parasitoid by an aphid predator, aphid parasitoid, and the key to look at is the exit hole on that mummy. Where a parasitoid's emerged, it's a nice round, quite smooth sort of exit hole. And if you look at the image on the bottom right, where the hyperparasitoids emerged from within, it's quite a jagged, rough hole. So useful keeping an eye out for that on mummies when you're doing your crop monitoring, because these can be something that can build up over a year and can sort of start to interfere with your biocontrol programs. Next slide, please. So, do I need to monitor hyperparasitism? We just talked a bit about that, and the key message is yes. Figures speak for themselves there. Some work a few years ago recorded up to 70% by August, and in 2012, and 95% by 2013. So that will be really having an impact on aphid control. So monitoring them is very good and useful to do, and then starting to think, if I start to find them, what can I do about this? So next slide, please, Chloe. So what should I do if I find evidence of hyperparasitism? Get rid of any banker plants, as they can increase the risk. Given this knowledge, it's sort of questionable whether banker plants are worth having, but that's for you to decide as to what works for you. But if you've got them, it's definitely worth keeping a good eye out for hyperparasitoids, including predators in your control programs will also help. So if you think back to a few slides ago where we had the parasitoid slide and then the predator slide, so things like aureus, lacewing larvae, etc., that actually feed directly on aphids, these will avoid the buildup of, help avoid the buildup of the impact of parasitoids. If you get hyperparasitoids, considering IPM compatible insecticides to control aphids within the crop is another option, and also taking a holistic approach. So if you've got those nettle type banker plants that we talked about a few slides ago outside, they could potentially be a source of hyperparasitoids. So if you're identifying hyperparasitoids in your crop, definitely worth getting a mower or strimmer out and flooring those. They'll grow back, but it will remove any hyperparasitoids from those that could move into the crop. Using parasitoid mixes as well, rather than rely on one species, may help. So that's another technique that can be used. Okay, next slide, please. So, Can bioprotectants be used to help control aphids? So the main ones available to us at the moment are Botanica and Naturalis. And some people may be making use of these for control of pests. Just worth pointing out, they have no label recommendation for aphid control at present, although they will have some effect, but normally when they're applied to control other pests. They can infect and kill aphids, but these aphids may continue to reproduce until they die. So the main message is to use them at low pest pressure. Okay, next slide. Then if I am making use of some of these bioprotectants, how do I get the best out of them? So they're different from conventional products. They're living things. They've got certain conditions that they need. So they need certain temperatures, certain humidities, and they're sensitive to UV light. So really applying them in the evening is going to give you the best results. And temperatures and humidities there. Okay, next slide. So can conventional pesticides be used alongside biocontrols? So yes, as long as they're IPM compatible. So this list here, see it as a bit of a decision tree really. So you've got your contacting and acting products, things like Spruce-It, and physically disabling products. There are various of those, and they can be applied when you can get good spray coverage of the aphid, when it's on the tips or the tips of shoots, and they're not a challenging spray target. We need to be hitting the aphids with the product to get good results here. Also with physically disabling products, these are more effective when used in drying conditions where they dry rapidly, so that's another consideration to get the best out of those. Eradicote Max is an improved formulation of Eradicote that's approved but not yet available, but it is coming to market. So when that comes through, it's one to start to make use of. So where these products aren't an option, you can start to think about, well, could I use something that's got contact or fumigant translaminar activity such as Aphox? Again, think about your aphid species. If you've got peach potato aphid, Mysis persicii, or melon cotton aphid, Aphids gossypii, this isn't really an option because they're highly likely to have some resistant individuals within that population. So that takes you further down the tree. You could think about systemic translaminar type products such as Sequoia. It's relatively new insecticide that we're very pleased to have and want to be made use of, but don't get overusing it. And we've got some other systemic products like Main Man. It's similar to chess if people haven't used it, so it can be a little slow acting, so maybe not the best product to use if the crop's very, very near to marketing. I would say Gazelle will give a better knockdown there, but some people are not wanting to use Gazelle because of customer preferences. Also got Batavia that we can think about, but that's got some restrictions in relation to flowering. And then there's also the opportunity of doing tank mixes, things like Majestic and Main Man. So that Majestic and Main Man mix, if you're able to get good contact activity of some of the aphids, the Majestic would give you good control of those, with the Main Man, the ones that are more difficult to get at. Okay, next slide, Chloe. So this is following on from our last slide, conventional pesticides for use in IPM. And various products here. We've got the IRAC codes that we talked about earlier in the presentation. As it happens, we've got some nice different codes to make use of. And important point there is to not exceed the maximum number of applications per crop or per year. So that's important, and those are put in there to prevent resistance developing. So it's important that people stick with that. And footnotes there cover the restrictions on Batavia and flowering. Okay. Also, we've got Botanica and Naturalis as bioprotectants for use in IPM. And they've got restrictions on the number of applications as well that can be applied. Okay, next slide. So some more information there. The IRAC pages are useful. There's a host of information out there for anyone who's more interested in reducing resistance developing within pest populations within your crops. Some good AHDB resources there, good old bedding and pot plant crop walkers guide and fact sheets. Next slide. This really covers the crop safety databases of, well, the side effect databases rather, of insecticides used with biocontrols. So it'll give you an idea of the number of days before we can reintroduce, the percentage reduction in your current biocontrol population you might expect from using various products, and they're a great resource, one to make use of. There is a little bit of variability between the data on some of the websites, so if you can't find what you're looking for, it's definitely worth having a look at other sites rather than just using one. Okay, that's us about done. Any questions?
Thank you, David. I've got a few which have come in. What program or approach would you take to control aphid hotspots in an IPM? Because obviously at the start of the year you get little colonies coming in, building up. So if you are using IPM and introducing parasitoids, what would you recommend to control the hotspots in that situation, please?
Shall I take that one, Chloe?
Yes.
As I said, there's lots of things to consider. So the key thing would be, firstly, the number of aphids you've got there. If you've really picked it up early and you're using IPM and you think that something like Aphids could pull it back, that's an option. That's not going to impact on any introduced predators. Alternatively, you might think the numbers are a bit high. I'd rather go in with some sort of insecticide. If they're not presenting themselves nicely on the top as a good spray target, it's something that's systemic, and you might choose to go in with something like mainland to not reduce the numbers. So that's the approach you take there. And then hopefully following on from that, your biocontrols will pull things back into line, and with good monitoring, hopefully you won't need to reapply further sort of chemical interventions, and you can tweak the numbers of predators you're introducing if you feel aphid pressure is a bit high still, and it's weekly management really as the season develops and as the pest pressure in line with the pest pressure really.
Okay, thank you, David. A specific question regarding Botanica and Naturalis. What are the main differences between the two products in terms of which one you should and shouldn't use?
Okay, they're both formulations of the same Bavaria. One's an oil dispersion, the Naturalis, and Botanicard's a wettable powder. We looked at Botanicard in the Amber project. I wouldn't like to say one's better than the other necessarily. They're like so many conventional products, there are various different formulations. So. Okay,
and following on in terms of specifics, got a question here about Flipper. If Flipper is physically acting, how come it is selective for beneficials and pollinating insects?
So that normally with physical products, so Majestic and Radicote are the same. Firstly, they have very short persistence, and they generally sort of have more activity on the pest than the predators. Again, look at those crop safety tables on the suppliers of biocontrols websites. But if you think about something like Aphids, the adult is probably more susceptible to any sprays than when it's inside an aphid as a mummy.
Okay, I got a comment back as well about Botanica. Botanica doesn't require any pre-soaking to activate spores. So that was one of the feedback I got from one of the other delegates.
Yeah, so that enables you to get the job done a bit quicker potentially. So
okay, possibly a question here for Chloe then. If obviously with sticky traps, it's only going to be suitable when aphids are on the wing. And any hints and tips about scouting for aphids in crops then if you're less reliant on sticky traps?
I guess I would just say, going back to what I said in my previous slides about, not just trying to kind of dash through and look at the tops of the plants, because sometimes, as we've said, they can be hiding underneath. So getting in there and picking up plants and looking at them underneath as well as just on top. Something as well to look out for that I've noticed, because aphids tend to excrete honeydew, that can attract ants. So maybe if you see little hotspots of ants around, that could indicate that you've possibly got some aphids. But looking at kind of hotspots where they could come in as well through the doors or through the vents, so kind of looking along crops that are immediately underneath vents or nearer to the door, just in case anything's coming in from outside that could then be landing on the crop. Those are kind of some key areas where you'd want to start looking, because you're more likely to find the populations there to begin with. So hopefully that helps.
Okay, thank you for that. Can I ask the audience if there's any more questions you'd like to pose? I've asked the ones that have come in so far, so this is your last chance to sort of pose any final questions to the speakers before I bring the actual webinar to a close. One here, possibly for David. The chemicals discussed, is this a definitive list of available approved aphicides?
yes, really it is. It's what we've got to play with at present in ornamental crops. Haven't included pyrethroids in there. They're a potential option, but as we said, they won't control a couple of the species you're potentially dealing with, and if you're using other approaches, they don't really fit. So yeah, and sadly there's not a huge list of new products coming through. There's potentially some botanical type products that should come through in the not too distant future, but yeah, that's what we've got to play with at the moment.
Another question here about parasitoids. Are they attracted to sticky traps, and do you run the risk of actually wasting money as a consequence?
You will catch some on sticky traps. And I've got people that use them extensively, and they also use some of the big roller sticky traps. So they're using those for other pests, not aphids, but it's again weighing up what you need to do in your situation. On a small scale, it's probably more of an incidental catch than and the few you catch shouldn't impact too much. So I would say using sticky traps to pick up pests such as any whitefly. I know we're not talking about whitefly today, but or thrips that are about is worth doing, accepting that you will catch a few predators on them.
Okay, and an interesting one here, an aspect we haven't touched upon today. Have you considered the effect of nutrition on aphid populations? For example, avoiding nitrate levels with lush growth.
If you've got lots of lush growth, it's obviously more appealing to aphids. So, but generally in the production of ornamentals, we're trying to avoid that, avoid having to then beat the crop back with loads of growth regulators. So yeah, if you have got lush growth, it is more attractive to aphids, I would say. So avoiding that is a good thing, really.
Yeah. And more, it's not really quick, more of a statement really about sulfoxaflor, that some customers are classifying it as a neonic. So it may be on, I guess, retailer ban lists. As that potentially could be an issue, I guess, David.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's something to bear in mind in terms of I guess insecticide selection across the board. It's not only the legislation; it's also the restrictions placed upon you by your own individual customers as well. To bear in mind, if you do tend to use, especially systemic materials which may be in the plant for a reasonable amount of time, like neonics. That's the other issue there as well, I guess. If there are no more questions, what I will do then is I will just move to my last slide just to wrap the webinar up, and to begin by thanking both Chloe and David for their presentations today on aphid control. If please don't forget to submit the basis and Neroso forms back to Sammy. As I said at the start, you should have had both of these in advance of today's webinar. You've got about sort of 15-20 seconds to download the handout in the actual webinar software if you haven't done so far. If you do think of any more questions, please submit them to me directly at that address, and I'll pass them over to the presenters in the next day or two. As I said before, the recording will be made available on the AHDB website, possibly, hopefully early next week with a bit of luck. And in terms of future AHDB horticulture webinars, we've got 2 coming up in March on Brexit. We've got the impact of Brexit on the ornamentals industry, with a focus on trade agreements, plant movement and plant passporting. And the second will be on sourcing and retaining labour. So a couple of dates, the 9th and 16th of March for your diary there, if you want to learn more about the legislation around Brexit. Apart from that, I wish you a successful 2021 season and good luck with your aphid control for the up and coming spring. Thank you very much. Bye.